One thing I do on Adobe Audition is I use the noise processing, like a denoise tool. I match that with the wavelength and just clean up the whole background noise, especially constant noises like fan, a fridge, aircon, and all this.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
What's up, podcaster? It is your host, Adam Adams, and we are joined with KB today. And he's been a podcaster for himself for about a year. KB, when did you start working for Pikkal & Co.?
So I started around 2017, 2018.
Okay, so prior to you launching your show, you've been producing shows for a few years.
Yep, I have been.
Did you have a different show before your current podcast?
No, Magic Mike was actually my first show that I hosted, produced and hosted. Before that, I was just a show producer, audio engineer. That's what I was.
Okay. And out of curiosity, it looks like when I look at Magic Mike on Apple, it says that the host is Pikkal & Co. So did your company launch the podcast and you've been the only host since it started?
So my company has been backing me. So it's supported by the company where, I get to use the equipment, I get to use the software. So basically they have been helping me produce the show. And I use the show to actually get insights from podcasters as well.
Okay, got it. So you do mostly interview style episodes or solo episodes or some combination?
So when I started out as a solo episode, try to get a rough feel of what I actually wanted to do. So initially I wanted to let's do a tutorial as to what I know from the scene. And as I slowly progressed, I realized actually there's a lot more that I don't know. And I thought, actually, why not just interview podcasters? Because at that point in time, when I looked up for a podcast about podcasters, they were very minimal. And I thought, hey, why not pitch in and why not learn some new things from podcasters in this space? And truth be told, I actually learned a lot from all the 60 plus guests that I've had on the show. There was one very interesting one. I clearly remember this. He said that when he takes his dog for a walk, he listens to his podcast. And he actually, when he finds a cut, he immediately edits it on his iPhone. So he actually edits it while walking. So I found that very, very interesting. So, softwares which I didn't know which existed, their thoughts on, at that point of time, there was a Clubhouse, their thoughts on that. So it was a very insightful show about podcasting from podcasters.
Okay. So it's all interviews. Yeah. That's all interviews. And over 60 guests so far. As you were launching that show, what did you do? Oh man, there's two questions that I have for you. I want to know big takeaways, a couple more takeaways of things that you learned from your guests on the show. But I'm absolutely curious where someone has produced, let's say, 1,000 episodes of other people's podcasts. And then they join this company as the chief engineer, Pikkal & Co., that does editing for podcasters. What did you do differently? How did you launch your podcast the correct way after learning what you've learned?
So let me take the second question first. What did I learn? Let me do that first. Basically, one thing which a lot of podcasters miss a bit in that sense is once you do a podcast, do a snippet, push it out, and you're good. It sort of gets lost along the way. That's what I learned through the production side of things. Even interviewing from, I guess I'll come back to that later. So one thing I made sure that I know that this content has to be there for a very long time. And I have to ensure that it's clean, crisp, and simple. It's just simple to listen. So what I did was aimed it at SEO. Played the SEO game where I'm putting in the host name. I'm putting in the podcast show name effectively. So when people are looking out for the show, they can actually look up on this and actually hear the host's background, the story. So that was one thing I targeted. Secondly, I kept the questions relevantly about them rather than, giving my inputs. So in terms of the show format, I made sure that it was a show about the hosts that were coming on rather than me, because I thought that was important. So I aimed it a lot on marketing side of things. I aimed it a lot on the guests side of things. So these were the two things, and to ensure consistency as well. I mean, I tried doing seasons in between, but what I did at the early stages was try to push out an episode weekly as much as possible, or daily as much as possible. Now, coming back to the first question, what I learned from these podcasts, as I mentioned, new softwares, new trends. One thing I did consistently learn is that no matter how many episodes you have done, there is always something that you do not know. It can be a very small thing, like if you want to record on Zoom, for example, you can click on a checkbox that says you can record it in separate files. Quality is not that great, but you can record in separate files. Most of these podcasters didn't know that. Some of these podcasters didn't know that, Identifying new trends, identifying new equipments, as an example. I remember there was this person who actually logged in from a headset, right? And I thought that headset was pretty good. It was a Logitech. It was one of the Logitech headsets, and it was pretty decent. I mean, it doesn't give you the warm sound that you and I have right now, Adam, with the microphone, but the audio quality was good enough. And a lot of these podcasters, actually all of these podcasters, had a microphone. You see, that's the key. They're not coming out from an AirPod. They're not coming out from like a Jabra. What is that? That desk microphone. I have no idea what the name is. I forgot the name. They all had a microphone. And it shows me that these podcasters are serious about it. Consistency. Consistency is the key to this. They just don't stop with 7 episodes and I give up. I mean, they focus on their audience, but they build it slowly. This is what I learned from them. Yeah.
Cool. A moment ago, I think when answering the second question first, I believe you said you promoted this on something called SU. I was not sure if I even heard you correctly, but you said when you started it, you put it on a certain place to get more people listening.
SEO. So what I did was I used SEO as a strategy.
SEO?
Yeah, SEO as a strategy.
Okay.
So what I did was I used SEO as a strategy. What I mean by that is, if you see my titling, there is no extravagant, there's no over-the-line titling, it's just a straightforward host name, host show name. So, when people are looking for the host and, they're looking for the show name, it's there. So I'm targeting that.
Okay. Got it.
Mm-hmm.
And what are your thoughts? It looks like for your podcast, you've got just a couple ratings or reviews through like on Apple. Out of curiosity, what is your strategy to try to promote it or connect with some of these guests or ask for reviews? What are your thoughts on both sides there?
I mean, one thing I've learned is reviews on Apple actually goes a long way. I think the more reviews you have, something I've discovered recently, the more reviews you have, the more recognition you sort of get on Apple. I mean, at its highest point, Magic Mike was doing, I think, top 4 in one of the countries. I think Singapore, if I'm not wrong. I'm not too sure. It was doing top 4 in marketing. So at that time, that was when I got the 2 reviews, actually, roughly around that time. So actually having reviews is something which I recently came across and say, actually, maybe it's important to have these reviews, because I mean, it gives audience that assurance that, hey, actually I'm not listening to some bullcrap. It's pretty decent. It's something I can take away. I can learn something. So actually having these reviews and, emphasizing, even putting a mid-cut or stinger somewhere saying that, hey, if you like the show, share a review or, put a review. All these small touches actually in the podcast makes a difference.
Question on that with the mid-cut or stinger. Can you first start by just defining mid-cut and or stinger, and then share with us how would somebody do that in practice? For example, the main question that I have is, does it get spliced in there at a random place, or how do you figure out where to splice it in? But yeah, go ahead. I loaded you with questions this time, KB.
No worries. So mid-cut and stinger is actually the same thing, in my opinion. It's basically an audio that you want to put in the middle of the track, anywhere in the track, right? Now, the best way to actually place your stingers is actually by looking at your audience data. I mean, Spotify gives you that sort of, listen time. Where do your audience drop off? It's not exactly the most accurate data, but you can actually have a look at it and see, how long are your audience listening into your podcast? For example, a 20-minute podcast, people are actually listening into, say, 15 minutes of it. After the 15 minutes, you can see people are dropping off. One place you can place the stinger is right at the start, because people are actually, sort of listening in then. They're trying to understand what the show is about, what the episode is about. Pretty sure there's an episode intro there. A stinger can come in like a couple of minutes just after you introduce the guest. And what I would say is not just drop in a stinger. It's more of like, have a smooth music transition. Then you play the stinger, If you like the show, hit the subscribe button. That is one place you can put. Another one is towards the outro, which I wouldn't recommend, because if people, this is me, or this is what I know, this is how I consume podcasts. I don't usually listen to the outros. Usually once the content ends, I sort of skip to the next one. Not sure about how you listen to a podcast, Adam, but yeah, I mean, I don't. And that's why I would actually advise, putting it either in the intro or somewhere where, it shows, your data shows this is where your audience are dropping off. Anywhere before this, perfect.
Do you think it should be, as you were explaining these, that it would be a separate audio file that was pre-recorded and maybe even has music behind it, and then you spliced in where you want it, and preferably in somewhere toward the beginning, as you stated? What I'm wondering, though, is if you're supposed to do live reads, should we do it as a live read with or without music, or what do you think?
I mean, if it's a live read, what I would suggest is, again, introduce your show, episode intro, introduce the guest. Whilst in the conversation, aim around the 3rd minute mark, 4th minute mark, while your audience attention is still there, grab them there. They're still listening into it, grab them there. And then you can go into the show, just before you dive into the main content. I think that is where the key point is. Because if your audience are sort of dropping off before that, then there's an issue. There is an issue there. And if you actually realize that actually putting the stinger there and audience are dropping off there, then maybe you can change your tactic and actually put it as the outro. To me, it all works based on science and data. It's having that data in front of you and actually looking, people are dropping off here, so I should edit it back. Or something like that.
So KB, how do you find out when people are dropping off? Like, what platform do you go to? Is there a certain hosting provider that you use that gives you that data? Do you have to pay more for that data? What does that look like?
So what I use is Transistor. Transistor is pretty robust in that sense to give me this data, but this data is pulled in from Spotify, right? So Spotify sort of gives this data where it says, what is the listen time? I'm not exactly sure what the metric is. It's sort of a listen time where it shows how long people are listening to. That, to me, is a very good data to look at. One thing that could be the downside of this whole thing is it may not be the most accurate. If, let's say, you're promoting both Apple and Spotify at the same time, your Apple numbers might be getting more listens compared to your Spotify. So focus on one platform when you're starting out. Focus on one platform. If it's going to be Spotify, then you have the data there. If it's Apple, I'm not sure. I think Apple are trying to roll out new strategies right now to sort of compete in this podcast platform space. So hopefully they actually come out with something where you're able to see your data more clearly. But Transistor is a hosting service which I use to actually monitor this data, which is being pulled in by Spotify.
So Transistor is similar to like Libsyn and Buzzsprout?
Yes, it is similar.
It's the hosting platform.
Yep.
But what you're saying is does it have better, more accurate data than Buzzsprout or Libsyn?
In my opinion, yes. It has a bit more clarity, in my opinion. It allows you to compare data. I'm not sure if Buzzsprout or Libsyn have updated their software, their technical side of things. But it allows me to see how's my episode performing now compared to the episode that was done previously, or compared to the first episode that I did, as an example. So it shows a graph. It shows like data, which is important. To produce your podcast, I think data is very important if you're looking to grow your audience.
So Transistor, what's the website there? So we can put it in the show notes.
It's transistor.fm. By no means I'm sponsored by Transistor, just heads up. Getting paid to say this.
Yeah.
Transistor.fm. I mean, I've tried across a few and I think Transistor is pretty easy to use.
Yeah. And KB, you said you are the lead engineer, audio engineer at your company, not trained in schooling, but from the last few years of doing edits, you've been able to learn some of that process. I'll tell you 100%, if you can help me figure this out for the listener, one of the biggest questions that I continue to get is an audio engineering question. And different people use different editing tools. Most of my company is using Vegas Pro. What was the company that you said, what's the software you use to do your edits?
I use Adobe Audition.
Adobe Audition. I think I've got like 2 people on my team that are editing other people's podcasts with that Adobe. And then there's people that use like Rock Band, and we could just name so many different things out there. GarageBand. GarageBand must be a video game. Well, thank you. Thank you for correcting me right in front of my listener. I appreciate that. What I'm wondering is what I think everybody else wants to know is how do we edit out different background noises from our podcast? Because as I think you and I would agree, KB, it's so much easier to just, have you heard garbage in, garbage out, KB?
Sort of.
Garbage in, garbage out. If you have a shitty like recording, if you're in a bad room with lots of windows, if your dog's barking, if you got the male person or you got sirens or something.
Sirens.
Yeah. Then that's already hard because it's a challenge to get out. So I think we would agree, treat your room, have carpet, have a good mic, use your headphones to minimize some of this stuff. Do your best. Sometimes people say record in a closet. I haven't done that yet, but I've kind of created a big closet in my office with all of this paneling on the sides.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure you know what I'm going to ask. And that is, other than having it corrected before you record, which is obviously the best, how will we on different platforms produce our episodes by editing out some of these high-pitched frequencies that we're hearing or low frequencies that might be sustained through the whole part? How do we make that sound? And our chair's rocking. How do we make that stuff minimized the best way when we are editing our own podcast?
So one thing I have to put it out there is when you are speaking, right? And you make this chair rocking noise and all that, it's much harder to completely remove them, because you're going to compromise your audio quality. And it's just completely hard to remove them because it's ingrained within that audio, right? One thing I do on Adobe Audition is I use the noise processing, like a denoise tool. I sort of match that with the wavelength and just clean up the whole background noise, especially constant noises, say like a fan, like a fridge, aircon, and all this. I think you were mentioning there's a space heater.
Yeah.
I don't think we can pick up any of the space heater sound right now because Zoom does a good job with sort of cutting that audio. But having that noise reduction processing, it has worked well for me. I have came across podcasters who use like outside third-party tool on Audition. It works for them. You pay for that. I've never used that personally because I think what Audition has works well for me. It does a decent job. It does what I want. Another one is noise gate, right? You can actually just noise gate some of these noises. Only thing with noise gate, which is sort of a pet peeve for me, if you hit it too strong, it sort of cuts your audio, because in a conversation, there's the highs, there's the lows. And what happens is like sometimes this noise gate, cuts your lows if the frequency is not, if you don't adjust the dB properly. So in my opinion, like noise gate is an option to remove all these constant noises. It's just all that knocking noises, chair rocking noises and all that. Of course, as an audio engineer, eliminate it when you hit the start of the recording. But when you hear it in like a record, like it's already ingrained in the recording, you can try the noise reduction process and you can just, do a bit of the noise gate there. This sort of helps. You can't completely remove it. I'm sure you can't completely remove it. It's just that you can sort of make it faint without compromising the audio quality.
Yeah. Okay. Have you helped anyone launch podcasts? I know your company serves a lot of podcasters. What are some strategies if the listener is not yet, they haven't launched, they've got their idea for their podcast, they want to have their podcast. What is the new process that you would do today if you started another new podcast right now? What's the process to kind of get onboarded to launching your first show?
So, firstly, we would actually ask them, why are they doing the show? What's the purpose of doing the show? And understanding that avatar they have.
Oh, keep going. By the way, and this is for the listener can hear this too. I type my notes in the chat box, and I forgot to tell KB that I'm not trying to give him a hint of something. I'm just typing. That's where I'm typing my notes. I could grab a notepad, but this usually works fine for me. And so, lesson learned. Always tell your person in the beginning before you start recording so that while they're talking, they're not like, wait, what does he want me to know? Anyway, no, I'm just taking notes. And you said the first most important thing, KB, is to know your why, your purpose behind having a podcast. What's the outcome you're looking for? Begin with the end in mind if you are Stephen Covey. Second is understanding your avatar. Will you go into that a little bit more?
So understanding what kind of a persona do you want to come across as podcast host? Understanding who wants to be the podcast host. So you can be like a Joe Rogan, you can have that conversation kind of style and do a 3-hour kind of show. You can do an interview show. You can do like a serious show. You can do like a true crime show. Understanding that avatar, what kind of an avatar do you want to sort of come across to your audience? That has to be in a very authentic manner. People can sense it when it's fake. So it has to come out in a very authentic, natural manner. So that is step 2. In my opinion.
Okay. Is there any other steps that if the listener wants to launch their first podcast and they want to do a good job, what other steps do they need to know?
Probably listen to Magic Mike as well. No, jokes aside. Of course, understand who your audiences are and sort of actually play your cards right in terms of marketing. Right? Why I emphasize on marketing is because you need to know how do you want to grow your show from there. So actually having that sort of game plan, say, okay, I want to test out maybe LinkedIn and see whether the audience reciprocate to my podcast. And actually understanding that it takes more than 10 to 20 episodes, in my opinion, to sort of really get your ground laid out for a good podcast show. Even more, actually, to be honest. But it sort of gives you that feeling where, first 6 episodes, okay, I know I can do this. I found the process. Understanding the process and finding a process, that's what's important. After the 6th show, improve yourself as a host. Ask better questions if you're getting guests, or, have a better mic technique if you are sort of doing a solo show. This comes after the 6th episode. And from the, say, 10th to 15th or 10th or 15th episode onwards, you focus on how do I get proper audience from there. So you can try different testing methods. Should I be putting out snippets? Should I be putting out transcripts? Should I be targeting SEO? Should I be on this platform, Google Podcast? Should I be on Apple Podcast? What else do I need to do? Yeah, and this is what, in my opinion, is the key stages, I should say. Once you understand your avatar, straight go into marketing and then into bettering yourself as a host. The key to all this is consistency. If you have a plan at day 1, try to execute it by day 14. Anything beyond that, it's just going to be a project that, I'll come to it.
I've got a lot of questions on that. Just in my mind, I'm thinking, I kind of wrote these notes. I don't know if they're absolutely accurate. If we do need to correct them, KB, and I'm putting words in your mouth, just let me know because I want to correct. I want it to be the way that you said it. I've got 6 main overarching ideas here for somebody who needs to launch a podcast. The first one is beginning with the end in mind, starting with their why, their purpose. What's the reason why I need to have a podcast? What do I want as my outcome from a podcast? Second is avatar / be natural. So what I'm taking from this is understand yourself, who you are, understand your listener, who they are, and approach them in an authentic way because they can tell. The third was figuring out a game plan. So we still have not launched a podcast yet, but we're starting by saying to ourselves, all right, I'm in Colorado. I want to get to New York. That's my why. That's my outcome. I'm the type of person who has to pee all the time. So I'm going to have to stop at lots of gas stations to be able to let my bladder go. And so now you figured out your avatar. Then you figure out the game plan. You're saying to yourself, okay, we're going to go through Texas and then we're going to go north. And then we're going to, when we hit this landmark, we're going to start going east on the 20 or whatever. You know what I'm saying? So that's the game plan.
Having that milestones, actually.
Yeah. The game plan or the roadmap to get to the destination that was our why is number 3. And number 4 is figuring out the processes and systems that we need to be able to make it easier to get there. Okay, I'm going to use a car. I'm not going to walk or take a horse. I'm going to use a car. That's my process, is to make it easier on me so I don't have to put forth as much effort, including getting your microphones and making sure that you're using those. KB, you put your finger up. What was up?
And also to actually figure out, are you driving the car? So in this instance, are you going to be editing the show or do you plan to hire an editor?
Yeah. Or are you going to take an airplane?
Oh, you're going to take exactly.
The good stuff. Oh, good. So the 5th one, the 4th was process. 5th was course correcting. So like as you're on the road, you're in the right lane, you're going to the right place, but you're starting to maybe just veer off. You see a pothole, the road is turning. You can't just go straight when the road is turning. You got to turn with the road. You got to avoid the pothole so you don't break the car. So it's course correcting. And as you're coming up to problems through the podcast and you're learning new things, you're implementing as you go was the 5th that I think I heard. And the 6th one is kind of one that needs to be part of everything. And it's consistency. So you got to figure out how to be consistent. It's interesting, KB. Does this 6 sound pretty close to what you were trying to say? So I'm curious, though, if you've brought up consistency 3 or 4 times now on this one episode, it's obviously very important to you. So you either made the mistake in the beginning or some of your clients were making the mistake and maybe losing listeners or something like that. What I want to gain from you is what can happen if you're not consistent and how do you stay consistent? If you don't mind finishing with that question.
So consistency, what happens is you're building up, say, a pressure cooker, right? You're building up that pressure. You're building up that, maybe pressure cooker is not a good example, actually. Okay, consistency. So, you're a team, you're playing like you're a neighborhood team, for example. You're a neighborhood football team, right? Okay. You get your first game in, you got your couple of fans from your family, they are in. And slowly, you're making progress. That's how a podcast is. You make progress to such a length that, now you're in the finals of the cup tournament, which brings you to the next division. And there you see your whole neighborhood there. What happens when you stop playing these games? Fan base drops. Likewise, in a I'm not exactly sure if that's the best example, but what I'm trying to say is with consistency, you will grow your audience. With consistency, people know at this time, at this date, I am expecting Adam's show. I am expecting Magic Mike, for example. So mentally, they are, tuning in to that day, that time. They are prepared for your show. So podcast is everlasting, but for those listeners who want to listen in, then they are going to grow. It's only going to grow from there. And from what I understand, Spotify and Apple Podcasts, they like all this kind of consistency because it's content for them. So having that consistent schedule plays a big part as a podcast creator.
So the big 2 things I've got 2 questions. One is, what can happen if you're not consistent? The second one is, how do I stay consistent? You're in answering the first question. you mentioned two big points. If you're not consistent, you can lose your fans.
Yes.
And my thought is this show called Ozarks on Netflix that my sweetheart and I were watching. When the end of the season happened and the next season wasn't out yet, it's not that they lost a fan. Like, I'm still speaking of the show like I like it, right? But I started other shows that were now in my way that I now had to get finished with. And Ozark season 4 comes out and I'm like, yeah, that's great. But I'm in the middle of these other shows. I'm already become a fan of these other shows. I will get to it.
It's in the pipeline.
I do want it, but I've got all these other shows now that are kind of in front of me because they let me down, because they didn't have an episode for me when I needed it. And I cried, and it was a really rough night without Ozarks that day, but I made it through and I found other shows, and I still haven't finished the season 4, even though it's been out for months.
Yeah.
So that the first part is that you could lose your fans. The second part is that there are algorithms that I heard you mention, KB, that Apple likes it when you are consistent. Apple and these other platforms, playing platforms, they give you more notability when they can see that you're publishing at the same time every week or every day. So you would lose out on those algorithms if you didn't have a show coming out consistently at the same time. So those are the two big things. It's letting your fans down and having the platform's algorithms work against you. Is that true?
Yes, exactly. The algorithm part is something which I've noticed from a podcast that I do at the site that is completely out of this context. It's something which I noticed that algorithm plays a huge part. Sort of like having a consistent publishing date helps with the algorithm.
Cool. I love it. And then if we want to be better at being consistent, how do we implement it? What do we need to know to be able to always have those episodes coming out at the right time of the week?
This may sound very weird, but don't work for the podcast. That is what I would say. Don't work for the podcast. Like, make it so process driven and make it as automated as possible. Because what you then do is you are preparing your content, making sure that your content is polished up for your fans, for your audiences, and you're focusing just on that. Come in, record, rest of it automated. Because bulk of the time, if you're actually going to spend it on editing, chances are that it's going to be a slower process, especially if you have like a main job and podcasting is actually a side thing. The chances are higher for you to actually drop off. So automating as much as possible, focusing more on your content, and also having a good mic. It all plays a huge part.
Having a good mic. That was one that I didn't really mention so well in number 4 part of the process, making sure that your recording sound quality is good. So I got those 2 major takeaways for what can happen if you're not consistent. And that definitely makes me want to be more consistent. Then I want to look at, you said, don't work for the podcast. And what I think I'm hearing is, don't let the podcast drain you.
Exactly.
Be the star of the show and let somebody else handle everything else. So you're basically saying after you press record, everything else can be figured out without your input. And this is one special thing that you've noticed can help you and your clients become more regular and consistent with their publishing schedule. Is because instead of having to have 8 of their hours per episode, they only have 45 minutes of their hours per episode. And that's just to press record.
Exactly. And I probably 15 minutes before that. But ultimately just focusing on the content side of things. That plays a huge part.
You mean like having really good content for your listener?
Yeah. Strategizing to actually do more good content.
And that goes back to the top 3. And I'll repeat them again. Figure out your why or your purpose. Figure out your avatar, you and your listener, so that you can speak to them naturally.
Exactly.
And then third was drawing up that game plan ahead of time, figuring out these things ahead of time. So that I love it. Okay, perfect. Thank you. I really appreciate that. All right, KB, anything else you want to share with the listener? And we'll wrap it up on today's conversation.
I think if you're going to start a podcast, for listeners who are starting a podcast, don't be afraid. Just follow these steps. I'm sure that, at some point you're going to figure out that sort of steady track, that sort of like, okay, this is what my avatar is. This is what I'm going to be like. So don't be afraid. Take the leap forward. And don't be deterred if, let's say, you are getting low listeners at the start. It's completely okay. Focus on your content and just keep the consistency.
Don't be afraid. Jump in, keep the consistency, but make sure you have a game plan.
Yeah.
That's from KB. KB, thank you for jumping on. Hey, to the listener, before I let you go, couple quick things is, number one, the Grow Your Show. That's my company. We serve podcasters. We help podcasters. We're the easy button. So you just press record. Let us take care of everything else. Kind of like KB was saying earlier. That's what we can do for you. Reach out. Go to growyourshow.com. And if you want to check out KB's podcast, Magic Mike, the link is already in the show notes. Scroll down. And KB probably noticed, because I forgot to tell him, I don't read people's bios on the podcast because I'm dyslexic, and that just sounds boring to me to go through anyone's bio, even though KB is so remarkable. If you want to go ahead and check out his bio, it's in the show notes. Scroll down, you'll see it. You can learn more about him, his company, and his podcast. I'll see you on the next one. If you're glad that you checked out the podcast today, if you got some value out of this episode, some actionable takeaways, I invite you to do one of three things. A, you could do a written review on Apple. Let us know what you think. Just an honest written review. B, you could share the podcast with a friend of yours who needs it. Or C, at the very least, implement what you've learned to take your business and your podcast to the next level. And I'll see you on the next episode.